Last night, the United States carried out military strikes inside Venezuela and forcibly removed its sitting president, Nicolás Maduro, from the country. Pause on that for a second, because we've become dangerously numb to how extraordinary that sentence is. This wasn't a diplomatic maneuver. It wasn't an economic sanction. It wasn't covert pressure or back-channel negotiations. It was bombs, aircraft, and armed force inside the borders of a sovereign nation. Let's be very clear about what that means. A country that did not attack the United States was attacked by the United States. A sitting head of state was captured by a foreign military. And the U.S. government has publicly stated that it will now run the country until a political transition is arranged. Those aren't my words. Those are theirs. This isn't rumor or speculation. It's not social media hysteria or partisan spin. It's not a movie plot, a video game scenario, or a thought experiment for some international relations class. This happened, and if your first instinct is disbelief, that can't be right, or that can't possibly be what just occurred, that reaction is understandable. Because actions like this are supposed to be unthinkable in a world governed by law rather than raw power. But here we are. So before we argue about whether this was justified, before we debate who deserved what, before we retreat into our political tribes, we need to slow this down. We need to understand what was done, why it was done, and what it means. Not just for Venezuela, not just for the United States, but for the kind of world we are choosing to live in. Because moments like this, they don't just change governments, they change rules. Let's be clear about something. This moment is jarringly at odds with the promises Donald Trump and much of the political movement around him have made. A central theme of Donald Trump's platform, especially in MAGA-aligned rhetoric, has been that America should avoid new foreign wars. He repeatedly criticized what he called endless wars in the Middle East, and pledged that if reelected, he would keep the United States out of further military entanglements abroad. Yet, what we witnessed last night, a large-scale U.S. military strike inside Venezuelan territory, is not some minor tactical operation on the high seas. It is a direct military attack on a sovereign nation, including bombardment of infrastructure and the outright capture and removal of the nation's president. According to Trump's own announcement, Maduro and his wife were captured and flown out of the country in what he described as a successful military operation. Trump even declared that the U.S. will run Venezuela until a safe, proper, and judicious transition takes place, and said that the U.S. isn't afraid of boots on the ground if that becomes necessary. Let's pause there for a second, because that phrasing, run Venezuela, isn't just a tactical detail. That's occupation-level language. Every major international reaction we're seeing, from China to France, from Russia to regional Latin American states, is rejecting this as an illegal use of force against the sovereign state. Many are calling it a blatant violation of the UN Charter and an act of armed aggression. Now ask yourself this: how does a pledge of no new wars evolve or devolve into the most direct military intervention in Latin America since the invasion of Panama in 1989? Before most of you were born. What happened to America first, meaning avoiding foreign entanglements? Instead, last night, America entered what amounts to a state of armed conflict. A state of war with another nation. And it gets even more serious when we talk about legality. Under international law, specifically the United Nations Charter, the use of force against another country is prohibited unless it's in self-defense or authorized by the UN Security Council. There's no credible claim from the U.S. that Venezuela posed an immediate threat to the homeland, or that the Security Council approved this assault. Independent legal experts are already describing this as a likely violation of international law, potentially qualifying as a crime of aggression. Let's unpack that phrase, crime of aggression. This isn't a rhetorical insult. It's a legal category in international law that describes a state's use of armed force in a way that violates the territorial integrity or political independence of another state. So let's be honest about what that means. If a government uses military force against another sovereign nation without lawful justification, and especially if it abducts the nation's head of state, that behavior falls into the category of conduct that international legal scholars call war crimes or crimes of aggression. Presidents and prime ministers are not legally exempt from the laws of war. Those laws are meant to constrain power and protect sovereign peoples. Make no mistake, Donald Trump is acting with the full authority of the U.S. government, launching military operations across a national border. Whether U.S. courts or international tribunals will ever have the jurisdiction to adjudicate these actions, that's another question. International law is deeply political, and the U.S. holds veto power in the Security Council. But the legal argument against this intervention is strong and widely shared by experts and world leaders alike. And that brings us to the real heart of what's happening here. A president who campaigned on avoiding new wars has just initiated a major military campaign abroad. A sovereign leader was captured and removed without any transparent legal mandate. And the entire operation stands condemned globally as a violation of international norms. So when people ask, is this war? Yes, in every practical definition. It is armed conflict. And when people ask, is this legal? The prevailing expert view is no, not under current international law, which means the real question isn't just whether this was a foreign war. The real question is whether our leaders, any leaders who order military attacks on other countries outside recognized legal frameworks, are accountable to the laws that were supposed to govern civilized international relations. Because either those laws matter or they don't. The administration has offered a justification for what happened, and it comes in three parts. First, they argue that Nicolás Maduro was a criminal, accused of corruption, drug trafficking, and links to organized crime. Second, they claim that Venezuela is no longer a legitimate state, but a failed one, sovereignty in name only, incapable of governing itself or protecting its people. And third, they frame the operation as necessary to stabilize the region and protect U.S. interests, economically, politically, and strategically. On the surface, this may sound coherent, even familiar. We've heard versions of this argument before. But here's where the logic breaks down. Even if every accusation against Maduro were true, and many of them may be, the conclusion does not follow. The United States does not have the legal authority to invade another country to arrest its leader. That's not a technicality. That's the foundation of international law. Criminal accusations, even serious ones, do not dissolve borders. Indictments issued in U.S. courts do not grant the U.S. military global arrest powers, unless we are the world's policemen. And moral condemnation does not erase sovereignty. If this were allowed, if this were the rule, then any powerful country could simply declare another nation's leader a criminal and send the military in to bring them to justice. Russia could do it. China could do it. Anyone with enough firepower could do it. At that point, the concept of international law collapses entirely. The second argument, that Venezuela is a failed or illegitimate state, doesn't rescue the case either. There is no clause in international law that says, if a country is corrupt enough, invasion is permitted. If there were, half the governments on earth would be subject to military takeover. State legitimacy is not determined unilaterally by the most powerful country in the world. The moment one nation claims the right to decide which governments count and which don't, law is replaced by hierarchy. And the third justification, stability in U.S. interests, is perhaps the most revealing, because this is where the argument stops pretending to be legal and becomes openly imperial. Stability has been used for decades to justify coups, occupations, and regime change. It sounds benevolent. It sounds responsible. But stability for whom? For the Venezuelan people who did not consent to this, and 40 of whom are dead? For the region, now facing escalation and backlash? Or for U.S. strategic and economic interests? When our interests become sufficient reason to bomb another country and remove its leader, we're no longer talking about law. We're talking about power. And power without constraint is not order. It's anarchy with better branding. So, does this comport with international law? The short answer, no. The long answer, very clearly no. The modern international system, flawed as it is, rests on one central rule. States are not allowed to use military force against each other whenever they feel like it. That rule exists for a reason. Without it, war becomes the default tool of politics. Under the United Nations Charter, there are only two circumstances in which the use of force against another state is legal. First, self-defense against an imminent armed attack. Not a hypothetical threat. Not a long-term grievance. An imminent attack. Something that is about to happen. Venezuela did not attack the United States. It didn't threaten an imminent attack. There is no claim, let alone evidence, that one was coming. So self-defense doesn't apply. The second lawful pathway is authorization by the UN Security Council. That requires international consensus, specifically approval by the world's major powers. It's slow, it's frustrating, and it's intentionally hard, because the whole point is to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral action. There was no Security Council authorization here. None. Which means the legal pathways are exhausted. What happened instead fits the textbook definition of the illegal use of force, the very thing the UN Charter was written to prevent after the devastation of World War II. And then there's the capture of the head of state. Forcibly removing a sitting president from their own country is not a minor escalation. It is a direct assault on the political independence of a nation. In international law, that moves us into the category known as a crime of aggression. This is important because people often misunderstand what that means. A crime of aggression does not require civilian massacres. It does not require genocide. It does not require concentration camps or mass graves. Those are different crimes. Aggression is about the decision to initiate war, to use armed force against another state without lawful justification. It's considered the most serious violation of the international legal order because it opens the door to all the others. Once the rule against aggression is broken, everything else becomes possible. And that's why this matters. Because when the strongest country in the world treats that rule as optional, the entire system begins to unravel. Which brings us to an uncomfortable question. If this is illegal when anyone else does it, what does it mean when we do it? So, are we at war with Venezuela? Formally, no declaration has been issued. Practically, yes, unequivocally. Wars are not defined by paperwork. They're defined by actions. Bombs were dropped on Venezuelan territory. Military assets were deployed across borders. A foreign government's leader was captured by force. Those are acts of war, regardless of the language used to soften them. The Venezuelan government has already declared the United States an aggressor. From their perspective, and from the standpoint of international law, this isn't ambiguous. It's armed conflict, and history backs this up. The United States has fought many wars without ever declaring one: Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. In each case, the absence of a declaration didn't make the conflict less real for the people living through it. It didn't make the bombs fall any quieter. It didn't make the consequences any smaller. What matters is not whether Congress votes on a word. What matters is that once military force is used against another state, a threshold has been crossed. And once you cross that line, consequences follow, whether you acknowledge them or not. Escalation becomes possible. Retaliation becomes justified in the eyes of the other side. Regional instability spreads outward, often in ways no one planned for. And here's the most dangerous part. When leaders insist this isn't a war, they often behave as though the usual restraints no longer apply. Oversight weakens. Accountability blurs. The public is told not to worry. But history tells us something very different. Wars don't need declarations to spiral. They don't need names to metastasize. They only need momentum. And once that momentum starts, it's rarely controlled by the people who claim they could manage it. So whether we choose to call this a war or not, Venezuela will, the region will, and eventually the consequences will force the issue for everyone else. Because wars don't ask permission to exist. So, did the U.S. military just kidnap a foreign head of state? Let's strip the word of its emotional charge and ask a colder question. What actually happened? Armed agents from one country seized an individual on the territory of another country without the consent of that country's government, without an extradition process, and removed that individual by force. That's not a hypothetical. That's the uncontested sequence of events. So the real debate isn't what happened. It's whether we're willing to accept a special definition when the United States does it. Under ordinary legal standards, kidnapping is simple: the unlawful seizure and transportation of a person against their will. No courtroom theatrics, no branding, no exceptions for flags or uniforms. By that definition, this checks every box. But he was a criminal! This is the most common rebuttal, and it's also the weakest. Because being accused of a crime does not nullify sovereignty. It doesn't suspend international law. It doesn't grant foreign governments a roaming license to extract people wherever they see fit. If it did, the world would instantly collapse into open season. Every authoritarian state on earth would claim the same right. Russia could seize dissidents abroad. China could abduct critics in Europe. Iran could snatch journalists off the streets in Turkey. We reject these actions, not because we like the people being taken, but because we understand what the precedent means. Law only matters when it protects the unpopular. But extradition was impossible. Also true, and also irrelevant. When extradition fails, the legal answer is not force. It's failure. That's the price of a world that claims to run on rules instead of power. The moment you decide that frustration justifies unilateral action, you are no longer enforcing law. You are asserting dominance. That's not justice. That's empire logic. Arrest versus abduction. An arrest requires jurisdiction, consent, due process. This had none of the three. Calling it an arrest is rhetorical laundering, a way to make something illegal sound procedural. A uniform doesn't transform an abduction into law enforcement. Looking at you, ICE. A press release doesn't substitute for a warrant recognized by the country where the act occurred. If this were done by any other nation, we wouldn't hesitate to name it. We'd call it what it is. This is the part that lingers long after the headlines fade. Once you normalize extraterritorial seizures, you don't get to complain when others follow suit. You don't get to invoke international norms after you've treated them as optional. You don't get to be shocked when rivals respond in kind. Power invites imitation, and history is very clear about where that road leads. Escalation, retaliation, cycles that no one formally declares until suddenly everyone is in one. So was it a kidnapping? Legally, yes. Functionally, yes. Politically? The word is avoided because it's inconvenient. But avoiding the word doesn't change the act. It just changes who we allow to commit it. And once you decide that might makes right, you're no longer arguing about law. You're arguing about who gets away with breaking it. So is the U.S. now being led by a war criminal? This is where precision really matters, because words like war criminal get thrown around casually. And when that happens, they lose their meaning. A war criminal is not someone we personally dislike. It's not someone with bad politics. It's not someone whose actions offend us morally. A war criminal under international law is someone whose actions meet the legal criteria for international crimes. And that's a much narrower, much more serious standard. In this case, legal scholars are already saying that what happened in Venezuela likely qualifies as a crime of aggression. That's not rhetoric. That's a legal category. A crime of aggression refers to the planning, initiation, and execution of armed force against another state in violation of the UN Charter. It focuses not on battlefield atrocities, but on the decision to launch an unlawful war in the first place. And that distinction matters, because aggression is considered the supreme international crime, not because it's always the bloodiest, but because it's the crime that makes all others possible. Now, has a court ruled on this yet? No. Will one? It depends. Less on evidence than on politics. The International Criminal Court has limited jurisdiction. The United States, shocker, does not recognize it. The powerful states have historically insulated their leaders from international prosecution. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's how the system has always worked. But here's the key point, and this is the part that often gets lost. The absence of prosecution is not the same as innocence. Plenty of acts are illegal, even when no one is punished for them. Plenty of crimes go untried because the accused are too powerful. Power has always shielded leaders from accountability. That doesn't change the nature of the act. It only changes who gets punished. So the responsible, accurate way to say this is not to shout slogans or jump to verdicts. It's to say this. The United States is currently being led by an administration whose actions likely violate international law at the highest level and may meet the legal definition of a crime of aggression. That should alarm everyone, not because of who's in office, not because of party or ideology, but because once a country decides that its leaders are above the law, there is no longer a rules-based order. There is only power, precedent, and fear. And history is not kind to societies that mistake immunity for righteousness. This is where the conversation stops being about Venezuela. Because if this stands, if the United States simply gets away with it, the precedent is devastating. Not symbolic, not abstract. Devastating. Because the rule that replaces international law is brutally simple. Power decides legality. Whoever is strong enough gets to decide what counts as justified. Whoever isn't lives with the consequences. The law of the jungle. And once that becomes the rule, no border is truly safe, only temporarily respected. So let's talk about what that means in the real world. What does it mean for Panama? A country the United States has invaded before, within living memory. A country whose sovereignty has historically been treated as conditional when U.S. strategic interests were involved. If regime removal by force is once again normalized, Panama doesn't need to imagine a hypothetical. It already knows how this story goes. What does it mean for Greenland? A strategically vital, resource-rich territory sitting at the crossroads of Arctic power politics. A place that has already been discussed, openly, as something the United States might acquire. If military force and coercion are back on the table, then diplomacy becomes leverage, not consent. Smaller nations and territories become bargaining chips in great power games. And what about Canada? Not invasion, let's be clear. That's not the risk. The risk is something quieter and more corrosive. Pressure, asymmetry, the erosion of the idea that alliances are partnerships rather than hierarchies. When one country shows it is willing to discard rules when convenient, even its closest allies have to ask hard questions. What happens when our interests diverge? And zoom out even further, globally. What message does this send to China, to Russia, to every regional power watching closely? It tells them this: don't bother with law. Don't wait for permission. Don't constrain yourself with rules your rivals won't follow. Just win. And once that lesson is learned, it doesn't stay contained. Borders harden. Arms races accelerate. Diplomacy becomes performative, not binding. This isn't a safer world. It's a world sliding backward, away from imperfect rules, and toward raw spheres of influence. A world of strongmen instead of institutions, of dominance instead of norms, of permanent instability where peace exists only until someone stronger decides otherwise. And history is very clear about what happens next in a world like that. They don't collapse all at once. They fracture, slowly, predictably, violently. Because Precedent once said, doesn't ask who intended it. It only asks, who's next? This isn't just a betrayal of international law, though it is that. It's a betrayal of the voters who were promised restraint, who were told this country had learned something from decades of intervention, escalation, and endless war, who were assured that strength meant knowing when not to use force. It's a betrayal of the idea that America stands for rules, not rulers. That we are the strongest, not because we can impose our will, but because we restrain it. And it's a betrayal of the post-World War II order that, deeply flawed as it was, managed to do one critical thing. It made conquest abnormal. It made invasion something you had to justify, not celebrate. It made naked aggression something the world treated as a crisis, not a precedent. That order wasn't perfect. It was inconsistent. It was often hypocritical. But it was better than the alternative. And the alternative is what we are drifting toward now. You don't have to like Nicolás Maduro to see the danger here. You don't have to excuse authoritarianism to oppose lawlessness. You don't have to defend Venezuela to defend the principle that borders, sovereignty, and law still matter. Because this isn't really about Venezuela. It's about whether power replaces principle, whether might becomes right again, whether the rules apply only to the weak. The question isn't whether this feels good today. It's not whether it polls well. It's not whether it satisfies a sense of revenge or dominance. The real question is this: what kind of world are we building when the strongest country on earth decides rules no longer apply to it? History doesn't leave this unanswered. When rules collapse, power fills the vacuum. When law erodes, force takes its place. And when the strongest nation decides it's above restraint, others follow or resist. Either way, the result's the same. Not peace, not stability, but a long, grinding return to a world where violence is normal, trust is impossible, and war is no longer the exception. It's the expectation. That's the real betrayal. The history is very clear about how that story ends.